Hello, aspiring record and gear nerds of the internet. If you're thinking about getting into vinyl, it's pretty tempting to do it as affordably as possible. But I'm going to explain to you why maybe you should reconsider that idea. Coming up.
Six in the morning.
Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about why you shouldn't buy a cheap. And cheap is a term that's extremely relative. What's cheap to one person is not cheap to another person. But I will be doing a video on how to pick out an affordable turntable, what to look for and what to avoid. This is why you shouldn't get a really cheap turntable. If that sounds interesting, subscribe. Now, this here is an example of a record player you might find at your local Target or, I don't know, wherever you would buy cheap turntables, Walmart, Bed Bath & Beyond. I don't even know where they're selling these things. I don't know. They're selling record players everywhere now. It's kind of crazy. Before we get into how to avoid a bad turntable, which this one is, we need to kind of talk about the main components of your system. Turntable is just another fancy word for a record player. So basically, a vinyl setup, as we'll call it, vinyl setup, is comprised of a record player. The record player is basically a spinning platter and a cartridge that has a stylus that sits on top of the grooves of the record, and it sends signal out of the back of this guy into what's usually a phono preamp, because to get to line level, you need to amplify the level from this guy to the level of, say, like a CD player. And then at that point, it's preamplified and then amplified even more, and then it's sent out to speakers. We don't need to get into all that. I'll be doing other videos explaining that a little bit better. What you have to understand is that generally a cartridge has low output that needs to be amplified by a component that could either be external or can be built into a integrated amplifier or into a regular preamplifier. This is an all-in-one thing. This thing, if you look at the back of it, these are your speaker connections. This allows you to switch between Bluetooth or the record player, and then here you have the output of this. So if you wanted to connect this to an amplifier rather than have it go directly out to here, you could do that. This is your power source. This is your power switch. So you might think about that like, oh wow, this has Bluetooth, this is a record player. This thing even came with speakers. Look, came with 2 of these. This is only one of them, but the other one's still in my daughter's room. This is where the bass comes out. This is where you plug in your speaker wires for the back of it. These are not great speakers, as you might imagine, but it came with them. They don't sound that terrible, quite frankly. I got this from a friend who said he couldn't get it to work anymore. He said that the one side didn't work. Turned out that the speaker cable was pushed in too far, and so it wasn't making contact. Easy fix, but he had already replaced it, so he didn't care. So I got this for my daughter, and I thought, looking at it, that it might be a good candidate for an upgrade. If you look at this, you could theoretically mount a different cartridge on here. And then also, this has an adjustment to change the tracking force. So tracking force is going to be a huge issue with this and all turntables that use this red cartridge of death right here. When I got this, it had this cartridge installed. This guy. As you can see, that little sharp pointy thing right there, that's your stylus, or what's colloquially called a needle. And the thing that it's attached to here that's made out of plastic, that's called a cantilever. And let me tell you, most of those are not made out of plastic. the fact this is made out of plastic is pretty horrible. Mostly what you'll find in lower end cartridges, lower end but higher quality than this thing, is a cantilever made out of aluminum, like this one. See that it's made out of metal and not plastic. This guy was originally bent like this. It was like that. I'm like, oh, that's not good. So immediately I knew I had to, at very least, replace the stylus on here. The stylus comes off pretty easily, and then you replace it by sliding this guy, or gal, back in there. But you have to be careful, because you can easily bend a cantilever, as we already discussed. I thought what would be cool is if I replaced this with this. This is the Audio-Technica VM-130 elliptical bonded moving magnet stereo cartridge. This thing costs $70. My friend told me he paid $60 for this and the speakers. Came in a whole little, came in one nice box filled with junk. My daughter wanted a record player and this was free. And I had this thing lying around. So I said, why not? Maybe I'll throw this on there. The first thing I did is I checked the tracking force on this. Now that is the amount of force that is applied downwardly to this that sits on the groove of the record. Now, as you might be thinking, you probably want that pretty light as humanly possible. Because, as I'm sure we all remember from science class, the first thing in physics you learn about, or one of them, is the concept of friction. And so the amount of weight you put on something that's going to be moving, the more friction it's going to cause, and friction causes damage. So the more weight you have put down on your record, the more you're going to damage it. So I have a digital scale that'll read me what the weight of the tracking force is. I think it goes up to like 5.2 grams. This thing was higher than 5.2 because it wouldn't give me a reading. Even when I adjusted this all the way back, I could not get it to read lower than 5.2, which is disturbing because the recommended tracking force on this guy is 1.8 to 2.3. That's like half of what this thing is. So that means you're going to wear out your records twice as quickly with this, which if you're buying something like this because you like to go to Goodwill and buy records out of the, for, I don't know how much the records are at Goodwill. Are they still like $2? They could be $5. I don't know. If you're looking to buy Goodwill records and play those, this is a valid choice. If you just want it to play records that are already pre-beaten up, this is fine. If you found a box of records in your parents' basement and you want to hear them, whatever. This is fine. If you actually want to start collecting records, like buying new records, this is not worth it. A new record costs like $25. You buy 3 records that you're going to end up damaging with this thing, you've made a bad financial decision. I listened to this. I straightened out the cantilever. I adjusted the counterweight as back as humanly possible to get as low tracking force as I could onto this. And I put on a real beat up record. And I listened to it with the original cartridge. And boy, oh boy, did it sound bad. Now again, if you want to just listen, if you just want this thing to make sounds from a record, by all means. If you actually want to hear how good vinyl can sound, this is not going to get you there. This is going to frustrate you. So I tried to install this. And as I've pointed out, theoretically, you can do that because there are these 2 standard mount slots that you can install a cartridge. So I did that. Although it was kind of difficult, there's not a whole lot of, I don't know if you can see this. So off those little clips are wires that feed through the tone arm. I could not really get the cartridge brought out far enough because there just wasn't enough room. But I managed to do it. I managed to get this installed. I use a protractor to get the geometry on it right. And I play the record again. Oh, and I actually had to put more weight onto the counterweight to get this down to 2 grams. Play it, and the volume is completely low, like super duper low. And I'm like, am I going crazy? And so I turned this up all the way, you could still barely hear it. So I went and I looked, and I pulled up the specs on this, and the tracking force recommended on this red cartridge of death is between 4 and 6 grams. Yikes. This thing is within spec for that thing, but within spec for this is going to ruin your records. And some people will say, well, it's not going to ruin your records. Well, you're going to prematurely wear your record. And it sounds bad. So I'm like, hey, if I can not have my daughter destroy her records. She has 1 record. She has a Taylor Swift record. If we can get her to not destroy that record and to get better sound out of it on a cartridge I already have that I'm not using, awesome. So not only is the tracking force ridiculous, but if you remember when I started this video, I was talking about the need for a phono preamp because the output on this is in millivolts, and a number of millivolts on this cartridge in particular is 4 millivolts on this Audio-Technica cartridge, which is standard for a moving magnet cartridge. This cartridge, or I guess it's actually this cartridge. This is the cartridge I pulled off. This cartridge, well, it's the same as that cartridge, but this cartridge and this cartridge, they give you a range because it's not precise because these things are garbage. 2 to 300 millivolts. That's almost 100 times the voltage of that. So my guess is that this thing doesn't even require a phono preamp, which is why you can just plug that straight out of those RCA cables back there, is because this doesn't need a phono preamp because this is just so loud and obnoxious of a cartridge. You don't need that extra amplification. This is doing all the amplification you need, which is not really what you want. The better sounding cartridges are moving coil cartridges, which have really low output. And you're asking your phono preamp to do the heavy lifting. So you get a better sound by not relying on this thing being loud. This thing is doing its own heavy lifting and it's not doing it very well. It sounds bad. At this point, I realize we're stuck with this thing. Unless I want to buy my daughter a stereo, which I don't want to do. I don't want to have to buy her a stereo to amplify this to speakers and add a phono preamp. Don't want to do that. What I end up doing is I order this thing, the one with the actual aluminum cantilever, from Amazon. And it turns out that you could actually replace these from that head shell. The head shell is where the thing actually resides. Basically, if you want to know, put like a screwdriver underneath it and like push it up and pull it out and it'll pop off, and then it like hooks in here and then you push it up. So if you have one of these, I totally recommend getting the better cartridge. Now, replacing this didn't make this sound good, but it made it sound less bad, which I think I got 2 of these for like $9 on Amazon. It's definitely worth it if you have one of these and are using it for not real listening. The Bluetooth on this sounds pretty good, actually. Surprisingly good, which is why I said those speakers aren't so bad. But this just sounds horrible. If you're looking to buy a record player and it has a red cartridge of death, do not buy. And then, like I said in my other video, which I should probably release today, we'll talk about the things you should look for other than the red cartridge of death. The red cartridge of death will tell you 100% not to buy it. But it's not the only thing to be on the lookout for, and it's not the only thing to avoid. Now, if you've watched this and you're like, well, I don't really care about the sound, and I don't care if it prematurely wears my vinyl, and you want something else to explain to you why not to buy this, I don't know if you've noticed something, but it has no cover. So you're constantly accumulating dust on this felt pad. which is not ideal. You don't want dust to get on here and then get onto your records. If you want to watch other videos that I've done, there should be a video here and like right there. Subscribe. You can listen to my dog run around. It's a good time.